Fun thing? Yeah, just me. Maybe it's up here. I don't know. These old buildings are. I mean, the reason that's also not happening. So, good morning. Morning. At least one person's waiting. It's good. Hopefully this will kick on here in a second. So, what's due today? Hormones. The hormone grid. Okay, we've all found the hormone grid. There was some trouble with it the other day. I don't know. It all looked fine on my end. And then even on mine, I can click on look at the student and it was still there. But I know several of y'all are having some. So hopefully that's there and we're good. Wednesday there's some questions about the cardiovascular system. There's especially some thought-provoking questions at the end. Okay, those are going to be due on Wednesday. Okay. Trying to increase sort of assignments, in-class assignments, and those things. Some of y'all need some points. It'd be helpful for you guys to get some more points so you can wash out some of the ones that we've missed. Okay. Command decision today. Next test, 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks from today. So Monday the 20th. That's the Monday of the week of Thanksgiving. Okay. 2 weeks from today. We will likely start material that will not be on the test on that Wednesday before. Okay. But we'll see how it goes. But that's where we are. 2 weeks from today. I will try by Wednesday to get some possible short answer questions up and posted for everybody and for you guys. So it will be over the VO2 and fatigue stuff, the metabolic rate stuff, hormones, cardiovascular kind of anatomy and responses to exercise. And then after we do this week, on Monday of next week, we'll cover the pulmonary side of things. I think we can knock out in a day. Okay. So that's what we're going to have on the next test. I've had one solitary person that has asked to do corrections on their test, or from that didn't do corrections on the first test that wanted to do corrections on the second test. So I will give you guys until the end of today to make those decisions. Some of you haven't even seen the test yet. I want to come by and check it out. But if you see what your grade is and you want to try to make corrections, I need to know by the end of today. If you didn't do them on the first test, Genoa is kind of a self-selection process. I think that's kind of where we are. Okay. Other things we need to talk about. We need to do some deep breathing over Saturday. Some deep breathing over Bedlam and what happened. Yeah. All right. Everyone that lives around us, all of my neighbors but one are big OU fans, and then the people across the street from us fall into OSU. So there was a little block drama in the neighborhood, putting up blow-ups and waving the flags and various things. So, okay. Anything else we need to catch up on, talk about, spend some time on, anything before we start talking about the cardiovascular system? You can stand up and do some jumping jacks and do, have some coffee, do some things. I'm seeing some tiredness this morning. Today is the day you can be the least tired all year. Lost daylight savings time, which is you got an extra hour. The other thing about that, we just decided it's a different time, right? We just arbitrarily all agreed, no, it's not 6 anymore, it's 7. How do we do this? Right? So I hope you are not like me, and I really despise it being dark at 5 o'clock. But that is where we are. Okay. All right. So let's do some cardiovascular stuff. Okay. So I'll try once again. We'll start everything by kind of drawing out what are we doing here, why is this important, why do we give a shit? Okay. So remember, muscles are the most important thing in the world. Okay? Muscles use energy so that we can move and everything else. As we use the energy, that triggers metabolism. Okay, that triggers metabolism. As metabolism goes up, we start to use more carbohydrate. We have a need to replace blood glucose. We have a need to mobilize fat out of adipose tissue, hence our hormone responses. Okay. The other big thing that needs to happen, okay, the other big thing that has to happen is as metabolism increases, we need oxygen to go to our muscles to use at the end of the electron transport chain. And we need a way, if we're releasing all of these hormones, to help us regulate blood glucose, to help us, right, regulate the breakdown of fat and adipose tissue. We need a way to move those hormones around. We need a way to move the glucose that gets mobilized out of liver glycogen around. We need a way to move those free fatty acids that are being broken down out of adipose tissue around. And the way that we do all of this is with the cardiovascular system. Okay? So that's in some ways the importance of this. Okay? We contract muscles, we generate force, we use energy, metabolism goes up. We have these other things that are going to regulate the metabolic response and regulate the substrate response, so metabolism can continue, so force can continue, and the cardiovascular system plays as big a role in as anything else in supporting that. Okay? In supporting that. That's to me the big thing that goes with the cardiovascular system. If it doesn't work right, we die. If it doesn't work right, we cannot exercise, we cannot get up, we cannot move around. But the reason it's so important is that it supports the function of pretty much every other tissue, every other system in the body. Okay? And so in the context of exercise, what it really does is it supports metabolism and it supports the muscle's ability to generate force. Okay? And if it doesn't work, then those things downstream of it cannot work. They cannot function. Okay? And so as you guys will see as we move along, especially on Wednesday, other than skeletal muscle and the changes that occur in skeletal muscle with exercise training, with hypertrophy, right, with changes in metabolism, the metabolic function and stuff in there, the cardiovascular system is the tissue or the system in the body that has the largest and most significant changes and adaptations that will occur in response to chronic exercise. Your heart changes, your blood vessels change, your blood changes. And all of those things will allow us to be better at exercise. Okay? To exercise longer, to exercise at a higher intensity. Because the changes in the cardiovascular system help us deliver more oxygen to muscle, help us deliver more glucose and more hormones and these other things that you guys will see. Okay? Huge, huge role, and the acute changes that take place as you begin to exercise are really, really important. We'll see lots of adaptation. Okay? All right. I'm going to breeze through a few structures. And by breeze, I mean you just like, here we go. Quickly, look, there's a heart, there's 4 chambers, yay, it's this left ventricle, haha. Okay? You are not going to be responsible for all of the different things and all of the different structures in the heart. You're not going to be responsible to know all of the different blood vessels, right? To know arteries, like specific arteries in certain tissues and those kinds of things. All right, this is not anatomy class. We're going to talk very globally about what do arteries do? What do arterioles do? What do capillaries do? Why are they important? But you're not going to have to know, like, right, this is the brachial artery, and then it splits and becomes, right, like the radial and the ulnar, and those things we're not going to have to know. Okay? Hello. Maybe this thing wants to work? Okay. So I've covered most of the functions. Okay. Two big ones that we haven't really talked about yet, that I didn't kind of in the introduction, is cardiovascular system plays a big role in immune function. Okay. Where do you think a lot of your white blood cells are? Okay, they're in the blood. And it plays a big role in regulating core body temperature. We'll spend an entire lecture talking about regulation of body temperature and how all of that happens during exercise and why that happens. Okay. But just know if your cardiovascular system does not work correctly and you cannot send blood to your skin to be able to sweat and dissipate heat via evaporation and convection, then you're not going to exercise or be alive for very long. So it plays big roles there, but we'll get into some of this stuff. Okay. We're going to break and kind of go through the system by looking at kind of its three major components. Okay. The heart itself, blood vessels, and then probably the one that's the most underappreciated of all of them to me, which is blood. We're going to treat blood in some ways as its own tissue, because what is in the blood, the number of red blood cells versus the amount of water, how much total blood you have, play a really key role, okay, in exercise. And we know this because the easiest way to be a better endurance athlete is to cheat, like Lance Armstrong did, and just give yourself more blood. Okay? If I give all of you an extra pint of red blood cells right now, you are immediately a better endurance athlete. Like 15% better right now as soon as it's done. Okay? So we'll get into kind of the how and the why of all of that when we talk about blood. Okay? Okay. Here is the heart. Right? I do this in health and fitness. Everybody take your left hand, put it out in front of you like so. Okay. Now, set it right, sort of just to the left of center, like this. Make sure that sort of where your pinky is facing at your left hip. Your thumb is pointing at your right shoulder. There's your heart. Okay. There's your heart. That's its orientation. That's about how big it is. Okay. And most of you, it sits right about here. That's your heart. Okay. Well, remember, I'm sure from anatomy, you are looking into the heart, so everything is flipped. Okay. Imagine this is my heart. It's doing this. So this is the right side. This is the left side. Heart has four chambers, right? It has a right and a left atria and a right and a left ventricle. That is all that I want you to know. Okay. There are valves that will allow blood to move between them, right? There are large veins, the inferior and superior vena cava, that bring blood back in onto the right atria, right? They're going to be pulmonary. We're going to call them sort of pulmonary veins. They're going to take blood sort of away here in the midst of all of this, all right? Which is kind of one of the weirdly named sorts of things. And then we've got things on the left side. Same deal. I don't care how many flaps the valves have. I don't care that you know what the names of the valves are or anything else. Okay. And what I'm going to point out is what I do want you to know is blood comes into the heart, okay, from what we call systemic, or I'm going to call it systemic circulation. You have all of this blood out in your body. That's systemic circulation. It is all going to come back into the heart on the right side, into the right atrium. Okay? It then goes from the right atria into the right ventricle. Then it goes off to the lungs. It then returns into the left atria, into the left ventricle, and then it goes out the aorta back into systemic circulation. That is all the more that I want you guys to know about flow of blood through the heart, okay, and the structure. That's it. That's all you got to know. Okay. We're going to talk about a lot of kind of functional variables of the heart. We're going to talk about systole and diastole and blood pressure and contractions and all of these things. And what I want you guys to sort of know from the start is all four chambers will contract and all four chambers will relax. But we're going to talk about function, and we're going to use the left ventricle, okay, as our kind of example or kind of the generic heart chamber when we talk about heart rate, when we talk about stroke volume, when we talk about systolic and diastolic blood pressure. All of those things we're really referencing what's happening in the left ventricle, okay? But I want you to appreciate before we get started that all of those same things are happening in both atria and in both ventricles all at the same time. Okay. So that's what I want you guys to know. Blood into the superior vena cava, right atria, from the right atria into the right ventricle, from the right ventricle off to the lungs, back into the left atria, then into the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta into circulation. Okay. As we move along today, we'll talk about the relative concentrations of oxygen and carbon dioxide in blood that has come back to the heart from systemic circulation, and blood that goes to the lungs, and blood that comes back from the lungs, in blood that leaves in the aorta. We'll talk about all of those, but that's all I want you guys to know about the flow. Okay? Are we good there? Are we okay with that? I'm sure Cindy made you guys learn way more. Okay? Way more. That's what we know that much. We can at least understand and appreciate what happens during exercise. Okay. So a very brief kind of thing, because I'm a muscle guy. We're going to talk about cardiac muscle and how it's ever so slightly different than skeletal muscle. Your heart is a giant muscle. Okay? Never forget that. But it's weird in comparison to skeletal muscle. And it's weird because it has a couple of special structures. And the big primary difference that makes cardiac muscle different than skeletal muscle is how we tell it to contract. Okay? How we tell it to contract. Under a microscope, it looks striated. It has sarcomeres, it has alternating light and dark bands, it's got this very tight organization of actin and myosin. It looks like, under a microscope, it looks like skeletal muscle. Okay? It looks like skeletal muscle. Okay? But it has some specialized structures that both hold it together and are going to play a role in allowing us to transmit electrical signals across it that make it a little bit different than skeletal muscle. Okay? Cardiac muscle has no motor cortex innervation like skeletal muscle. Okay? No things. We'll talk about how it contracts in just a minute. It does not have any voluntary control. It generates impulses, it transmits action potentials just like the sarcolemma does, just in some ways with excitation and contraction, like skeletal muscle, but it starts in a different way. We have things called desmosomes and gap junctions, which occur at these structures called intercalated discs. Okay, desmosomes are clamps in essence. They're going to hold one cell, one cardiac muscle fiber in really tightly with its adjacent one. Okay, we want to keep that sort of tightness and closeness together. You have gap junctions, which are basically just holes or pores or doorways that allow the quick passage of ions from one fiber to the next. Okay. Holding them tightly together gives a structure, and it keeps us together so that we can then transmit things. And then having the gap junctions let us pass ions, which means we can easily generate action potentials and transmit them from one fiber to the next. Okay. So, other things to keep in mind. You guys, if you have listened, y'all actually see a heart, y'all dissect a heart, like you see one. Okay. So, the thickness of the walls of the ventricles and the atria, especially the thickness of the wall of the left ventricle, okay, is going to vary. The size of the heart is going to vary. The size of the lumen space, right, the empty space inside each one of the chambers is going to vary based upon a whole host of different things. Okay, but the thickness of the myocardium, so the thickness of the heart muscle, is going to vary based upon the stress placed upon it. It's going to be really, it's going to do some weird things. Okay, the thicker the muscle, the more dangerous it is. The more likely you are to have cardiovascular disease, to have problems later on in life. We'll get into probably a little bit on Wednesday and more so next week on why is that going to be the case. Okay, but we want a large heart with thin walls, and we'll talk about why that's going to be really important from a conduction standpoint later on. Okay, of all of those things, the left ventricle has the thickest wall. It likely is going to be the largest. Exercise can increase the overall thickness of the myocardium, but it also really increases the size of the heart. It increases the size of the internal chamber in the left ventricle. One of the single most important adaptations that takes place with endurance exercise, okay, is that the size of the inside of the left ventricle gets bigger. Okay, we talked about those things. We talked about those. Let's talk about how the heart contracts. Okay. Who should I pick? Shell. Can you make your heart stop beating? Do you really want it to? Can you do it for us right now, please?
I'd rather not.
You'd rather, how would you go, would you propose to go about doing this? Like I'm telling you, like right now, you're sitting there, you're not doing bicep curls, right? Your bicep is not contracting because you're choosing not to. Choose not to contract your heart and tell me what happens. You die? Can you make that choice? If I tell every one of you, stop contracting your heart, can you do it? Some of y'all are either not paying attention or I'm not sure. Y'all are like, I don't know. Right? Can you? Can you make it stop? No. Right? Have you ever thought about making your heart contract in your entire life? Maybe some of you in some very rare instances or something, right? Have you ever? No. I can barely talk and walk at the same time, much less can you imagine if every 0.8 seconds you have to think, contract, 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 okay, while you're walking around, while you're doing something, okay? This, I hope, illustrates that the heart does not get its signal to begin to contract in anywhere close to the same way that skeleton does. Okay? The heart contracts all by itself. It's spontaneous. Okay? That doesn't mean that we can't exert some level of control, that we can't do some things to make how often or how powerfully it contracts change. But the initiation of a heartbeat is mostly out of our control. It is done by something called the cardiac conduction system. And the fact that it generates its own electrical signal without input from the brain is called autoconduction. Okay? Autoconduction. You have specific nervous tissue inside the heart. Okay? And it does not require an external stimulus or an external signal to start. It is under the influence of some of those signals, okay, which I'll demonstrate in a minute, but it doesn't need it to start with. Okay. All of us, in the absence of some other sort of external input, have a spontaneous intrinsic firing rate of the heart of somewhere between about 70 and 80 contractions per minute. Okay. So about every 0.8 to 0.9 seconds, an action potential gets generated in the right atria, and that begins a full contraction of all of the chambers of the heart. Okay. Now, almost none of you have a heart rate of like 70 or 80 beats per minute. So clearly we have some ability to influence, make it higher, make it lower, and do those things. But this is what is going to happen in the absence of any other input. Let me see.
my current heart rate is 80 beats per minute. And I'm up here wondering now. Nope, now it's 90. Okay. I'm thinking about it and I'm making a change. Okay. It does not have a resting measurement from today. So, okay. Sweet. All right. So let's walk through what this is and then we'll talk about how we, right? I assume you guys y'all have seen all of this before, like 3 or 4 times. We're going to do it again because it is really important. Okay. There are 4 parts of the cardiac conduction system. The SA node stands for the sinoatrial node. The AV node, or the atrioventricular node, these are little bundles of nervous system tissue. Okay? You then have what you might normally think of as like nerves or nerve fibers that are going to run down the middle or the septum of the heart here. This is called the AV bundle or the bundle of His. Why is His spelled H-I-S? I don't know. Okay, here, and then it reaches the apex of the heart and they begin to branch and thin out and they will turn and come back up and make these much smaller nerve fibers that are going to kind of wrap themselves around the bottom of the ventricles called Purkinje fibers. Okay. In these 4 components, okay, the SA node is what we call the pacemaker. This is the tissue that initiates every heartbeat. In this tissue, there are sodium channels that are leaking. And leaking means that they're spontaneously allowing a little bit of sodium to come in all the time. Okay? And so as that sodium leaks in, eventually the inside of the cell becomes positive enough that it reaches threshold and we generate an action potential. Boom, action potential, here we go. So action potential starts in the SA node and it then spreads across the surface of the atrium. Told you guys, cardiac muscle is tightly linked to each other, which means it's very, very good and very easy to spread action potentials along the surface. So it spreads out from there, and the atria polarize and the atria contract. Okay? The atria begin contracting from the top and contract here, spread that contraction down. Why is this important? Why would it be advantageous to have atria begin to contract from the top? Okay, to allow them, when an atria contracts, where is it trying to send the blood to? The ventricles. Anatomically, where are the ventricles in relation to the atria? Right? They're below, right? And so if I started contracting down here and worked my way up, then the blood's not going to go towards the ventricles, right? So you guys see how that makes really good sense that it starts here and it contracts and it pushes things downwards. Okay? And again, we'll talk in the ventricles. The heart, when it contracts, sort of twists on itself. Okay? So think of cardiac contractions and blood and its movement like we're wringing water out of a wet towel, or out of a wet shirt or a wet pair of jeans or something. You're going to twist on the top and it forces things downwards. Okay? Or in the ventricle portion, it forces things upwards. And so this is why the system is set up is so advantageous. It contracts here, it spreads kind of top towards bottom, and it's going to push the blood more forcefully or more efficiently down into the ventricles. Okay. Now, when it reaches sort of the wall here between the right atria and the right ventricle, it reaches the AV node. And the importance of the AV node is that it is connected to the bundle of His. And so, in the nervous system, okay, we can conduct an action potential faster than it will move across the surface of the cardiac muscle cells themselves. Okay, so when it reaches the AV node, it will attempt to spread it somewhat into the cardiac muscle of the ventricles, but what it really does is it focuses the signal down the bundle of His into the Purkinje fiber. And it moves so fast that what it essentially does then is it initiates a muscle contraction or a cardiac muscle contraction in the ventricles that begins at the bottom and moves its way up. Okay. And so when it begins at the bottom and it moves its way up, oh, look, the aorta is up, right? So contract here, squeeze, 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 force the blood up. If you look at right on the right side to get blood out, right, out into pulmonary arteries, they are also up. They're kind of sideways, kind of up and sideways, but squeeze, 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 up and out. Okay, that's the virtue of this. What this also sets up, okay, is a very clear pattern of contraction and a relationship between contraction and relaxation of the ventricles and the atrium. Okay. When a chamber is contracted, we call that systole. Systole. When it is relaxed, we call that diastole. This is where systolic and diastolic blood pressure and the names of those things come from. Okay. During a single heartbeat, which we will oftentimes refer to as a cardiac cycle, during a single heartbeat, both atria and both ventricles undergo a period of systole and diastole. Okay. So during one heartbeat, atria contract. Okay. While they are contracting, ventricles are relaxed. So there's this alternating pattern of the atria are in systole, therefore the ventricles are in diastole. This is good because when they're relaxed, there's lower pressure inside of them, we can move blood in. Atria contract, shoot the blood into the ventricles, which are relaxed. Then the ventricles contract and push the blood out into circulation. While that is happening, though, the atria are relaxed, which means their pressure is lower, so that as we force blood through the big system, we can have a lower pressure in here and we can bring some blood back in. Okay? That's this alternating pattern. If that pattern doesn't work, you cannot move blood around. This is why, okay, when people they go into cardiac arrest or they have some sort of cardiac arrhythmia, that we need to put the paddles on, right, and shock them or get the AED out and shock them to try to reset this normal rhythm. Because in a lot of instances when things go wrong, you have atria and ventricles contracting at the same time. And when they're contracting at the same time, there's no difference in pressure, and you can't move, the blood doesn't go anywhere. It can't move, and that's why that's such a dangerous kind of a dangerous condition. Okay? But all of this comes back to SA node first, spread the contraction across the atria. They're contracting, ventricles are relaxed, top down. Then we're going to spread from the AV node down the apex, down to the apex, spin back up with the Purkinje fibers, contract the ventricles from the bottom up. While they're contracting, the atria are relaxed, right? And blood moves out, and we start the whole thing over. All of this happens every time your heart beats. Every time. You guys want to guess how many times has your heart beat in your life so far? You want to do some math? Let's say you have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute. Okay? How many minutes are there in a day? 60 minutes in an hour times 24. So there's about 1,450 minutes in a day. So we'll multiply that by 60. You got about 86,000 heartbeats in a day. Okay? 365 days in a year. About 31.5 million heartbeats in a year. I don't know, y'all are, let's just say 21 years old. Okay? Most of you guys are looking somewhere a little north of 650 million heartbeats so far. Okay? Double that plus some for me. Okay? So I'm at, 1.2, 1.3 billion. Can you imagine what your legs would look like if you had done 650 million squats in your life? Or how big your arms would be on all of these things? And you never think about it. You never have to think about it. It just works. Okay? It will be 500 billion times in your lifetime if you live to be 75 or 80 or 100 or something. Okay? Again, these are the things about physiology that they blow my mind. It just absolutely blows my mind that this stuff happens and it just works, and away we go. Okay. It's on the next one. I should have shown this first, I guess. You guys have seen an EKG before? I feel out of necessity that I need to show you an EKG because maybe some of you are taking it right now. If you haven't, if you take exercise testing and prescription, you guys will see EKGs. Okay. But an EKG is electrodes put around your heart, and it's a way for us to visualize, okay, in both time and in some ways in space, the action potentials that are moving around in the heart. Okay. So when you record an EKG, we can do it very simply. We can what we call a simple 3-lead EKG. We just put 2 electrodes here around the heart. We can do them up here and here, and then the ground one in the back. Or you can put up to 12 leads, and you kind of go all the way around the heart. And you can try to get an EKG that's going to better visualize each atria, each ventricle, and whatnot. But here's the general thing, okay? This from P wave to the next P wave here is 1 cardiac cycle. This is 1 heartbeat, okay? So the initiation of everything is what's called a P wave. Why is it a P wave? I don't know. I don't know why we call it a P. Why is it not an A wave, right? Or why is it not a D wave for depolarization? I'm not sure. But what this is, this initial bump here denotes SA node fires, depolarization of the atria. Okay. There is then some lag in time, okay, depending upon what your heart rate is, and we get this big spike here, right? That's called a QRS complex. This denotes when the ventricles are depolarized. The top of that is what's called an R wave. When your watches try to do anything and put the EKG on, we want to measure your heart rate. What we're actually counting basically is the number of R waves in a given period of time. Because that is our marker that the left ventricle has polarized and it should contract. Okay? Then there's a little bit of time here, and then we see what's called a T wave. And the T wave is representing essentially in this lag of time, the ventricles have depolarized. The atria have not yet contracted again, but we are running sodium potassium pumps and things and repolarizing the ventricle so it can contract again. And so we can look at the timing of all of this. You get a T wave, and some other small bit of time, and then you're going to get another P wave, and it repeats itself over and over and over again. Okay? That's what's going on in the midst of all of this. I show this not because it's going to be of huge use for us in this particular class, okay? But there is real clinical diagnostic usefulness in understanding what is happening in the EKG to help us understand, especially in people that have cardiovascular disease, right? Do they have an issue in an atria? Do they have an issue in a ventricle? Is it the right side? Is it the left side? Okay. And is that due to a valve problem? Is it due to an SA node or an AV node problem? Is it due to the fact that there is not enough blood going to a certain place? All of those different things will cause very distinct, very noticeable, very consistent changes in what the EKG looks like. Okay. And so cardiologists will use that to help us diagnose different kinds of cardiovascular disease, different kinds of impairments. The craziest things in the world, you have a heart attack. As soon as they know you're not going to die, they put an EKG on you and they put you on a treadmill and they say, go run. They want to try to recreate a heart attack so they can look at what's happening on the EKG. Try to understand where is the problem in your heart. right? Is there a blockage in a coronary artery that leads to a particular chamber, right? Is there a valve issue? Is there an SA or an AV node issue? So that they can have a better understanding of what they need to do to try to fix that. Okay. Very, very, very important clinically diagnostic test. Okay. And what we tend to see in most people is when you're resting, it looks normal, but as soon as we have you exercise, as soon as we challenge the heart to make it work harder and faster, that's when problems tend to manifest. That's why they're going to put you on the treadmill and make you walk, or then walk from jog, and those kinds of things. Okay. Or you get to be my age and you go and you do what's called a stress test, and they just check. Even though there's not been a problem yet, they put you on like, all right, let's have you run. Let's see if we can, if anything is going to be kind of early signs or early pauses. Okay. That's why I tell you guys, I want you to know just bare minimum basics of all of this. We're not going to get into any sort of arrhythmias, any sort of pathology, and trying to interpret that. Do a little bit of that of exercise testing and prescription. Maybe a little bit in chronic disease. I don't know if Regina does that still. We used to do that in chronic disease. All right. So let me point out one thing. We talk about the cardiac cycle some. We talk about what systole and diastole are. Okay. But the important thing, one of the other kind of last importance that I really want to emphasize from this slide is that at rest, okay, the lower your heart rate, the longer, okay, the longer the period of time is that each chamber is not contracted. Diastole is longer. It will last longer when heart rate is low. Probably not today, but on Wednesday, you guys will see why that's so important, especially during exercise. Okay. The longer the diastolic period is, the longer time there is to move blood into that particular chamber, which means we can fill that chamber to a greater extent, and that's going to have some knock-on effects to how strong the chamber contraction is, to stroke volume, and therefore the cardiac output. Okay. So at rest, about 40% of a cardiac cycle is systole, about 60% is diastole. Some of you that are really well trained and you have heart rates down in the 40s, then it may be even more like 70-30, okay, 75-25, something like that. Okay. That's going to become really, really important as we sort of move forward. Okay. I will introduce this idea now. I'm sure you guys have had this before, okay? But this is, and I will say this now, from a fitness standpoint. From who wins an endurance race standpoint. Stroke volume is arguably the most important cardiac variable for predicting VO2 max, for predicting endurance exercise performance. That will not make sense today. By the end of class on Wednesday, it will be much more clear. Okay. So we're going to start though very simply by defining what is stroke volume. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that gets pushed out of the heart every time the left ventricle contracts. Okay. Now, every chamber in your heart has a stroke volume, right? Every time an atria contracts, a certain amount of blood leaves. But as I said, the reference for all of our variables is going to be the left ventricle. So this is how much blood enters the aorta from the left ventricle every time it contracts. Okay? It tends to be, I don't know, somewhere between about 60 and 80, maybe even 100 if your heart's really big, milliliters. You're all like, how much is that, Dr. Black? I don't know. It's, a little bit, a little tube. It's about like this thing. I used to use the example. Anybody ever seen a real 35mm camera film? A kind of real camera. Film comes in these little black plastic kind of like tubes. There's a gray top on it because if you expose the film to light, the film gets messed up. And so that little thing, if you filled it up with fluid, it's about yay big and about that big around. It's about 80 milliliters. But you guys have never seen, many of you have never seen an actual camera that takes film. And so the analogy doesn't work. I got to find a new and a better thing. Okay. So understanding what stroke volume is, I think is pretty straightforward. But then there's some additional terminology that we need to talk about how we calculate it, that are going to become more important as we manipulate things that are happening during exercise. So I want to go ahead and try to talk this sort of thing through about how we mathematically arrive at that. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I think I may have already your water things. I'm not going to do anything with them.
Yeah.
May I borrow them? Okay. Perfect. Okay. So there are two variables that we need to understand. One is called end diastolic volume. The other is called end systolic volume. Okay. These represent an amount of blood, okay, in the left ventricle at a particular moment in time. All right. So what we're going to do, the black water one, which is very heavy, okay, the black one, this is your left ventricle, okay, left ventricle. The white one, this is sort of basically systemic circulation and all of the blood that's in systemic circulation. Okay? So what happens is we are in a period of diastole. Okay? So just imagine, and this is not 100% true, but there's basically no blood in the left ventricle. Okay? We've just gotten finished contracting. It then goes into diastole, so it is relaxed. We're going to take blood from systemic circulation to now into the right, into the left atrium. And we start dumping that blood into the ventricle. Okay, fluid from here, pour. Okay. At the exact instant, right before we go into system, right before the left ventricle contracts, there is X amount of blood or X amount of fluid in there. That is in diastolic volume. Okay, it is the amount of blood in the ventricle right before it contracts. So it's sort of max filling. That's what's in there. Okay, then it contracts. Pour from the left ventricle back into systemic circulation. So the volume in here is going to fall. Okay, now it has contracted. At the very end of systole, a certain amount has left the left ventricle. There's a certain amount that's left in there. We almost always have some blood left in the left ventricle at the end of contraction, end of a heartbeat. You rarely, unless you're at very, very max exercise levels, you rarely can fully empty the left ventricle. So there's some that's left in it. Okay? So if I know how much was in there right before it contracts, and I know how much is in there right at the very end of the contraction, the difference between those two things is how much blood left. Okay? And so that's how we calculate stroke volume. How much was in when it was done filling, how much is left there. The difference between those two, by necessity, is how much blood went into and left and went into the aorta. Okay? So that's how we calculate stroke volume. This will become important when we talk about things that happen with exercise.
No,
There we go. Because when your heart rate is lower, diastole is longer, so there's more time to fill. We can make this version go up. Okay? When your heart rate's very high during exercise, this goes down. Time goes down, so filling may go down. Okay? When we stimulate the heart and we make it contract more forcefully with epinephrine and norepinephrine, we squeeze more blood out, so in-systolic volume goes down. And so both of those things, if I can fill to a greater extent and I can eject more, I can make stroke volume go up. The difference between these two gets bigger. Okay, and vice versa. So it's really, really important concepts. Okay, I will on Wednesday, we will talk about things that affect in diastolic volume. We'll talk about things that affect in systolic volume, and therefore they will obviously affect overall stroke volume. Okay. Does that make sense to you? Yes, understand the idea of stroke volume. Okay. Good. If you want to be a better endurance athlete, you've got to find a way to make stroke volume increase. Got to find a way to make stroke volume increase. Okay. I guess I sort of just breezed past it in some ways, but heart rate is just the number of times that the left ventricle contracts in a given, usually in a minute, in a given period of time. Okay. So if we know the number of times that the heart contracts in a minute, and we know the amount of blood that gets ejected every time it contracts, we can multiply those two things together, and we get a variable called cardiac output, which is hilariously abbreviated as Q. Okay. But cardiac output is a measure of the amount of blood that leaves the left ventricle in 1 minute, usually. It's expressed very often in liters of blood per minute of time. Okay? Most of you, depending upon how large you are, your actual size, because your blood volume is going to be dependent upon that, have a cardiac output somewhere between about 4, 5, or 6 liters of blood that gets ejected and passes through your heart per minute. Most of you have a blood volume of somewhere between 4 and about 6 liters of blood in your body. A rough rule of thumb is that at rest, you circulate the entirety of your blood volume through your heart 1 time per minute. Okay? If you're a 4 liters of blood in your body person, because you're a relatively smaller individual, blood volume is very high relative to body size, then you will circulate all of that through about once. Okay? I will show you guys some things on Wednesday that cardiac output is the variable that is most closely or highly correlated to oxygen consumption at any moment in time. Okay, so you have some resting aerobic metabolic level right now. We can express that in oxygen consumption in milliliters per billion body weight per minute. That's going to correlate to whatever your cardiac output is at. As you make energy expenditure goes up, cardiac output will go up correspondingly very, very tightly. Okay. So what this means is that as metabolic demand increases, we raise heart rate and we raise stroke volume to try to meet that metabolic demand. Okay. This is why every new sort of fitness tracking device measures heart rate. You can prescribe exercise based upon metabolic intensity based upon heart rate. It's also though why max VO2 is going to correspond to max cardiac output. Whoever in the class has the largest maximal cardiac output per their body size will very likely have the largest VO2 maximum, largest aerobic metabolic capacity. And we'll get into a little bit of the how and the why of that on Wednesday. Okay. All right. You guys had a class where you measure blood pressure? We used to measure blood pressure in health and fitness and then in one of the labs. Then I think if you guys have had personal training or strength and conditioning or something, anybody done blood pressure? Anybody awake? Well, you've done blood pressure?
Yeah, I was in physiology last one.
Was in physiology lab. You'll do blood pressure in physiology. You'll block that part out too. Okay. All right. So I'll cover some of the very basics here. Okay. Blood pressure is the force that the blood, which is a fluid, is exerting on the inside of a blood vessel wall at any moment in time. We very often measure blood pressure in the brachial artery, so we measure it here, right, kind of right under your bicep. And so what we're measuring is how much force is the blood exerting to push against the inside of the brachial artery. Okay? We can calculate that in the aorta, we can calculate it in the left ventricle, we can calculate it in the femoral artery. Pick a relatively superficial artery, we can measure it anywhere. Okay? We generally express it in two numbers, right? So my blood pressure is 100 over 60, or it's 112 over, I don't know, 74, whatever it's going to be. Okay? That top number is what we call systolic pressure, and then the bottom number is what we call diastolic pressure. And so the way we have this kind of closed loop, okay, that is your cardiovascular system, is that when the heart contracts, it's in systole, okay, pressure gets raised, and we're going to push the blood along. So blood moves via pressure. It moves from high pressure to lower pressure. So highest pressure in the left ventricle, next highest pressure in the aorta, and then so on and so forth as we move our way down. Okay. So we raise it during systole to try to move the blood. That's when pressure in a given artery is going to be highest. So that's what we're measuring. And then diastolic pressure is pressure when the left ventricle is in diastole, when it's filled. Okay. That tends to be the lowest pressure. And so the difference in pressure between systolic and diastolic pressure, okay, how big that is going to be one of the primary factors that determines to what extent blood is going to move from one area to the next. Blood moves from high pressure to low pressure. So it contracts, this pressure goes way up, okay? The pressure immediately in front of it in that blood vessel is whatever our diastolic pressure was. So when this increases, if this stays the same, the gradient gets bigger, and it drives the blood down. Okay? Drives the blood down. When we exercise, you guys will see, and we'll talk about it on Wednesday, systolic pressure tends to increase, diastolic pressure should stay the same. If your diastolic pressure goes up, when you're exercising, you need to call an ambulance right now. Right, there's a lot of things. That's what's going to happen. Okay? There's a variable called mean arterial pressure that we don't really use very much anymore. It was much more popular in the 80s and 90s. But mean arterial pressure is a way for us to try to, over the course of one cardiac cycle, estimate kind of the average pressure that a blood vessel sees across sort of one heartbeat. And so it's normally calculated, and we can play around with this a little bit based on heart rate. It's essentially diastolic pressure counted twice, systolic pressure counted once, right? Because you spend at rest about 60% of a cardiac cycle in diastole. And so one third roughly systole. So it's basically the average of diastolic twice, systolic once divided by 3. Okay. As one of those goes up, mean arterial pressure goes up. Okay. We use it traditionally as a marker of kind of stress on a blood vessel over every cardiac cycle. We've become kind of less enamored of this now. They have some other measures that they prefer, but that's kind of what this is going to be. Okay. Now, we'll get into this a little bit more probably by the end today, but for sure on Wednesday, and that's the control of blood pressure. Okay, control of blood pressure. So blood pressure is weird. We have to have a certain amount of blood pressure. We have to have a certain systolic pressure, or blood will not circulate. And if it doesn't circulate, then you die. So low blood pressure is bad, but also high blood pressure is bad. And so we have to kind of fit and be in the middle. So we have lots of different ways that we control your pressure. Okay. One of the big ways to control blood pressure is with your kidneys, is with blood volume, urine volume, plasma output, and those kinds of things. But the other big way that we control blood pressure is we can change the diameter of blood vessels. We can make them sort of larger or smaller, and that changes the pressure across those vessels. Okay, and so we'll get into a little bit of fluid dynamics, hopefully by the end today, kind of after we cover the next couple of kind of anatomical slides. Okay. Okay. So we've done a little bit about the heart, we've done a little bit about the variables related to the heart. Let's talk about blood vessels. Okay. The vascular system or the vascular tree. Okay. I know that you guys have learned a lot about all of these things, but we have arteries that carry blood away from the heart. Remember, arteries, it's not about oxygen levels, although generally oxygen is higher in arteries. It's about away from the heart. Arteries branch and narrow into these things called arterioles. And there's about 7 or 8 different kind of levels of arterioles. They will eventually branch all the way down to these very, very tiny blood vessels. So small, they essentially can fit one red blood cell through at a time. Those are called capillaries. Okay. Those are capillaries. The capillaries will then eventually kind of work themselves and fuse back together and make things that are called venules, which are not on here. And then the venules all fuse back together and form veins. Okay. Capillaries are where we exchange nutrients, hormones, gas, everything at the tissue. And then venules and veins bring blood back to the heart. So arteries and arterioles carry stuff away. Capillaries let us exchange things at the tissue. And then venules and veins bring it back to the heart. Right? You have millions of blood vessels in your body. Right? Probably have billions just of capillaries that are going to be there. I want to point out a couple of important things. We'll get into those in the next couple of slides, but I'll start with it now. One of the primary things that makes arteries different from capillaries and veins is arteries have smooth muscle around the outside of it. Okay? You remember from physiology, if you guys don't do digestion in physiology, right? You have smooth muscle that surrounds or kind of the outside wall of your digestive system. Okay, and we have it around these arteries. What it does is smooth muscle is kind of hot mess muscle fibers that go all over the place. And when they contract, though, their primary issue is to kind of move things, change the diameter of various tubes and those things. So we have smooth muscle, especially around arterioles. And what the smooth muscle lets us do is we can change the diameter of arterioles. Okay? You have some smooth muscle in arteries. You have a little bit in the venules and a little bit in the veins. It's mostly going to be an artery and an arteriole. And so this is one of the ways that we control both blood pressure and we control where the blood goes at any point in time in the body. Is by changing the extent of contraction of smooth muscle around arteries and arterioles. And by doing that, we can change the pressure. When we change the pressure, we change how much blood is going to go through at any one point in time. Okay? Okay. I'm going to come back to this. I don't know why this slide is here, but we're going to come back to this in a minute. Okay. So to understand how we use the vascular system to distribute blood to tissue and to make sure that we're getting enough oxygen and glucose and hormones and free fatty acids and certain things, we need to figure out where is the blood in your body right now. Okay. Where is it right now? As you guys are sitting here, as you're resting, especially if you had breakfast, okay, somewhere between, I don't know, 40 to about 60% of the blood in your body is going to what we call the splenic regions, okay? As you sit here, stomach, intestines, liver, kidneys, okay? Very much these things are going to help us digest food, help us break things down, help us get nutrients into the bloodstream to take out to different tissues, okay? Because the blood goes there when you're resting because those are the most metabolically active tissues. increasing metabolism in any given tissue is one of the primary ways that we drive blood to that tissue. That should make sense, right? If ATP use and demand goes up, we need to send more blood there so we can send more oxygen, more glucose, more free fatty acids to hopefully supply the increase in energy. Okay? At rest, we've only about 15% of the blood in your body is going to skeletal muscle. If you're like me, you're a fidgeter, maybe a little bit more than that. But in general, that's where it is. Okay? The heart gets a certain amount of blood, the brain gets a certain amount of blood. That's relatively constant. Okay? And when we're resting, most of the rest of it is going to our digestive system, those splenic regions. When we begin to exercise, though, and this is why understanding energy demand, but then also how we regulate arterioles and arteries is important, we switch things. During exercise, about 80% of the blood in your body ends up going to skeletal muscle. Okay? We shunt almost all of the blood away from your digestive system during exercise. That's why they tell you not to go swimming after you just. You shunt all the blood away and you stop digesting, you've got undigested food stuck sitting there in your stomach, and then you feel sick. That's how they tell you. Okay. So we're going to send blood to the muscles, plus we're going to increase cardiac output. So what we can figure out is that during exercise, we can up the amount of blood that goes to skeletal muscle by the combination of those two things by about 25 times. Okay. That's because the muscles during exercise use so much energy. We have to have this very, very, very large capacity to shift and make sure all the blood that we need goes there, but also as we increase cardiac output, so we increase heart rate, we increase stroke volume, so we're going to send more blood more often, so pump faster to a greater extent, and then send it all there. Okay? When you eat, blood goes to the digestive system because that's where metabolism increases. And then during heat stress, we're also going to send blood to the skin. Okay? And this is a problem during exercise. It's a problem because there's a competition. When you exercise and it's hot, you want to send blood to your skin to help dissipate heat, which is good. Otherwise, you will cook yourself. Okay? But for every amount of blood that goes to the skin, that's blood that can't go to skeletal muscle. And if it can't go to skeletal muscle, that's less oxygen, less glucose, okay, that we can send there. So potentially, we're limiting ATP generation and therefore force production. And there gets to be competition. The problem is that in the very short term, the muscles will always win. And at some point, you will stop sending blood to your skin and redirect most of it to skeletal muscle if you're able to push through those things. And it can put us into a lot of heat stress and why very well-trained people who are very used to tolerating heat stress, okay, can get themselves into very dangerous situations when you exercise at high intensities for long periods of time. It's hot out. Okay? And we'll cover more of that a little bit later on. Those are going to be the things, okay? Metabolism helps us determine where the blood goes in your body. Blood is going to tend to go to the most metabolically active tissue. Because changes in metabolism are going to regulate or help us regulate the diameter or the extent of contraction in the smooth muscle and arteries and arteriole, which are going to push the blood all around. Okay. Okay. Here is, in many ways, just a kind of cartoonish depiction of all of these. I don't know why it always makes me think of like a butcher shop or something. You've got like stuff that's hanging around, but here you have heavy exercise and we've had rest. Okay. You've got during heavy exercise a cardiac output of about 25 liters per minute during rest. Okay. We are kind of down around 4 or 5 liters per minute. But what you will notice, look at just the differences, okay, in the size of these organs. At rest, a lot of blood is going liver, stomach, intestines, okay, kidneys, very small amount kind of going to the heart in those ways, right? Bone, brain, skin, skeletal muscle. But just look at the differences in these numbers. Okay, look at the differences in the number. So we're going to have about 25% at rest going here, only 3 to 5% during exercise. Look, note the heart stays roughly the same at about 4 to 5%. Kidneys go from 20% down to 2 to 4. There's no need to filter your blood and make urine if you're exercising. Okay, we want all that blood to go swim elsewhere. Brain needs a constant amount. Okay, it goes from 15% to about 3 or 4. In an absolute sense, the blood flow is identical. Okay, but because cardiac output goes up so much, relatively it's going to be a little bit lower. And we have some really cool data from, they can do a thing called functional magnetic resonance imaging. They put you in an MRI machine and they have you think about things, they have you exercise, and we can measure the change in blood flow in certain areas of the brain. So the blood flow to the brain stays relatively constant, but where that blood goes in the brain will change. You can imagine during exercise, motor cortex goes up. If I have you do math problems, right, it's more the prefrontal cortex and some of those areas that play a role in cognition and memory and some things like that. Okay, skin blood flow goes up. Skeletal muscle blood flow also goes way up. Okay. I will introduce 2 terms and then we will stop. Because I want to leave you talking about Poiseuille's equation and some things. Okay. As I said, blood distribution is primarily controlled by the diameter of arterioles. When we increase the diameter of an arteriole, that's called vasodilation. Vaso meaning vascular, meaning blood vessel, and then dilation means it's getting bigger. Vasoconstriction is the opposite. Okay, it's when a blood vessel is going to go from being like this, it's going to squeeze itself down. When I want blood to go to a tissue, I vasodilate to that tissue. When I don't want blood to go to that tissue, I vasoconstrict that particular tissue. Okay? So during exercise, I vasodilate all my blood vessels that go to skeletal muscle, generally, and I vasoconstrict all of the blood vessels that are going to take blood into stomach, liver, kidney, and the spleen. Okay? Very good. All right, we'll leave it here. Hormones we're going to do today. Cardiovascular questions due Wednesday. Turn them in on Canvas, please. We will have a quiz on Wednesday. Our cardiovascular quiz will be in the class on Wednesday. That's 2 weeks from today.